Toxic parents is a phrase that has literally burst into our lives. While earlier it was called the problem of fathers and children, which everyone seems to have, now the issue has reached a new level. The internet is full of articles and books describing toxic relationships, parental abuse, and the results of the presence of all this in our lives. To some, the problem seems almost made up. They say that children are growing up so infantile, selfish, and ungrateful. For others, such relationships with relatives have become a real tragedy. Anna, 36 years old, does not communicate with her mother for more than 6 years. For the first time in my life, I began to live without fear and realized that it was possible to be happy. Her friends called me and said, "Shame on you. It's Mom. You're just ungrateful." My mother was born in the 1950s, a very educated woman. She was raised by her aunts and grandmothers who had lost their children in the war. They thought that since the war had ruined their lives, at least let the child live. I don't care at all about the fact that she beat me as a child. It's easy to forgive. But she hit her parents. I can't forget that. Dad ran away a long time ago. He paid alimony, even though my mom said there was none. He tried to communicate with me, but my mother prevented it. Then he gave up trying. In our society, the system of protecting women from a psychopathic man is weak, but somehow it swings. But with regard to women, there is no way. The man has practically no chance of taking the child away. So I stayed with my mother. If my mom hates these movies, I'm going to hate them too. If my mom hates me, I'm going to hate me too. Who didn't know my mother very well thought of her as a super intelligent, well-mannered woman. I really wanted to interact with this version of her, kind, intelligent, but that's not what got to me. I was almost always the bad one. Abnormal, an idiot, a sack of shit. These words were common. I think she made up some kind of ideal for herself. When very occasionally I matched it, she even praised me, but mostly I was different from him. I wasn't even accepted as a B. She was extremely aggressive about me getting married. She didn't like my husband. She told me how to communicate with him better, which was to build and manipulate him. Also, I had become, in her opinion, a slut since I got pregnant. I live in Novosibirsk. She's in another city, but she called all the time, often came for a few days. She would say to me, "Oh, look at the love. He'll leave you anyway. You'll come crawling back on your knees." She was a sweetheart and a sweetheart to my husband. But as soon as he left for work, she let all the dogs down on me. When I was suffering from morning sickness, she brought a herring with her and started boiling it right in the pot with my head. I was vomiting from the smell, and she cornered me and started forcibly opening my mouth and shoving herring eyes into my mouth. During the 9 months of my pregnancy, I endured such an onslaught of anger and insults from her that by the time I gave birth, I began to lose my mind. I didn't think to stop communicating with her then, because I had this thought in me. She's a mother, and a mother is sacred. I still wanted to build a good relationship with her. I had this illusion. It was my mother. Maybe she would understand me, see that we had a good family, and maybe be a good beloved grandmother, I dreamed. I used to bake bread when she came over. I wanted to make her happy, to reset the relationship, so to speak. My boy was born with severe malformations. The child has the most severe autism, among other diseases. My mother kept insulting not only me, but also the baby. She said that this bastard would ruin my life and that I had to get rid of him. She said, "Put him in an orphanage. Give him to your mother-in-law if that fool wants a freak." During our last conversation on the phone, she started yelling something like that again. I had rarely argued with her before because I was always terrified of her, but this time she raised her voice. I told her to leave me alone and not to touch my son, and I reminded her that she had never had a quiet day during her pregnancy. She was shocked, so she started insulting me more. Then she threatened that since I dared to yell against her, she would not communicate with me until I asked for forgiveness. But at that moment, I realized that I needed to protect my family, so goodbye. I remember her words, "You'll understand how to live without Mom." And I knew how. It was easy to breathe. I'm 36 years old and I've only recently let go. I started working with a psychologist and I realized that I wasn't as horrible a jerk as I'd been led to believe. The decision to stop communicating was a conscious one. I just didn't have the strength anymore. She didn't call me either because of pride. Then somehow she found my phone, but I asked my husband not to pick up. She directed her friends who shamed me, said I was an ungrateful daughter, and almost demanded I apologize. We don't communicate for 6 years. There is no desire to resume the relationship. The first thing that changed immediately was a sharp improvement in my child's condition. Literally within a month, he started to notice things around him, and my tantrums stopped because there were no calls from her. I related it all. The baby used to have a very nervous mom who would get scolded harshly on the phone and be nervous all day long. And here mom doesn't get scolded. She's smiling. I feel so much better. Although I confess even now I sometimes think, I wish I could share this with my mother. She would like this, that. But I understand that if I go back to that person, it would start all over again. She said so often that she was unlucky with her daughter. What do you mean, unlucky? As a mother of a disabled child, it seems to me that when you have a healthy child, it's a blessing that blows your mind. What more do you need? I was left with not resentment, but rather pain. The pain that this was in my family, with me, with my childhood in my life. John, 26, tries to minimize contact with his parents. About 6 or 7 years ago, I left my hometown. In the first years, I somehow tried to establish a relationship, or rather to involve my parents in my life. Then I realized that they and I have a completely different understanding of many things. Sometimes my parents try to lead me into some sincere conversations, but when I start to tell them something, really sincerely talk to them and discuss things that bother me, including in our relationship, I feel that they do not understand me, and then mutual reproaches begin. All these attempts at some kind of sincere communication end up in a formal style of communication. Now I'm trying to bring the relationship closer to zero, to make it neutral, as between people who have their own lives. It's been building up for a long time. Since I was a child, they taught me to be independent. I was an ordinary kid. I was involved in clubs. They weren't really interested, and I didn't really let them into my life. I had no need for support. I always came home on time. I could always cook for myself, and I didn't have to beg my parents all the time. You could say so. And if I needed some clothes, for example, they saw for themselves because I was in front of them. When I left, I felt that I disappeared from their apartment, disappeared from direct sight, and their interest in me disappeared too. My parents had an opportunity to help me because in principle they allowed themselves to spend money on some non-essential things, so to speak. They could have fun, plan a vacation abroad, and in the meantime I needed 1/10 of what they were spending. I was on welfare. I had no way to support myself while I was studying. I stopped feeling that support, stopped feeling that my parents were somehow thinking about me. They only sent money on request. This amount was only enough for a short period of time, a week or two, for food and basic household needs. I had to borrow money and figure out ways to somehow survive the moment. Literally, winter came. I had no winter shoes. I called my parents, but it was not part of their plans. I told my parents about my life, about problems with my peers and so on. But I didn't see any interest from my parents, didn't hear any questions. What and how? When I graduated from university, I found a job, and in principle, I was already doing well. I even sorted out my housing. And in one of my conversations with my mother, she called me, congratulating me on the housewarming. She asked me how to help me. I said I needed a washing machine. She said, okay, but then she disappeared and was never heard from again. She didn't communicate with me for the next couple of months. She didn't get in touch with me. It's not about money, it's about attitude, about attention. At first, they made a situation where I couldn't rely on them, couldn't count on them, weren't interested, didn't try to share my difficulties, to support me. And then they started resenting the fact that we don't have such warm relationships, that I have my own thoughts and we don't communicate much. They think that I just need to grow up. They put it down to some kind of childishness, to the fact that I haven't grown up yet and am acting like a teenager. In my opinion, the only way to preserve communication is for me to find a therapist and for my parents to find a therapist to work through this situation and study it thoroughly. I do not see a way out of this situation on my own. I do not feel the need for any kind of warmth. I have my own circle of people. I have my own family that will always support me, and I am sure of them. But at the same time, I understand that sooner or later, the time will come when we will have to have some kind of contact. I love my parents. I think that my parents also love me in a sense. But here, it seems to me, the problem of how they were brought up, the problem of their childhood, their psychological problems. My love is not unconditional either. I would also do well to work through this moment, to reflect on this state, to understand why I love them in a way that is not what they need. But in our culture, it is not customary to go to psychotherapists. Parents think that it is unnecessary. I think that if I don't work it out, then communication will stop altogether. So far over the years, I haven't been able to pick up the phone and cut off all contact. But we only call a few times a year on holidays. As a rule, it is a short formal conversation. Leela, 30, 8 years old, does not communicate with her mother for 1.5 years. I didn't talk to my mom for 1.5 years, and before that I had very minimal contact for 6 months. We couldn't talk normally. Even when she called me to visit, she would start nagging, snapping. She would start nagging, snapping. She would get sick. She would start freaking out. Even on the phone, none of our conversations could end. Almost normally. I have the whole set of psychosomatic illnesses that are typical of all children of abusive parents. At a certain point, when I had already started working with my brain, I began to realize that as soon as I saw a call from my mother, I just started having wild pains in my back. Abuse is some things both explainable and unexplainable. What society recognizes as violence is being thrown out into the entryway. Some slapping, some screaming. That's what I remember from the age of 5. She often had temper tantrums. As a child, I wondered if she really gave birth to me. To say that I didn't feel my mother's love is a very mild description. There was hatred. I remember myself from about the age of 1. Sobbing. No one came near me. I have 80 pictures in my album of me crying. My first memory is her teasing me for hours. I want to grab it, look at it, and she wouldn't let me. When she gave it to me, I had this feeling of anger at a young age. I broke that what? My mother used to play the victim, that she was pulling us, that she gave birth to us. She was a saint. You live with that and don't realize that something is wrong. I was a good student. I went to classes on my own. I had good relationships at school, at university, at work. Nevertheless, my mother convinced me that I was not normal. From the age of 13, you could tell the anger and rage increased. After the divorce, she began to have absolute power. She used to piss me off on every holiday. If it was a birthday party, she would drive me to such a state that I cried in front of my guests. For example, the hot meal was delayed for 15 minutes. In principle, it's nothing, but I was humiliated in the kitchen in front of a friend. There was some verbal abuse. There was a constant feeling that someone was hovering over you and was ready to hit you at any second. You are such a bastard, a disgrace, a shame, and so on. She might mutter something in front of my father, but she didn't beat me up much. One time I didn't have time to clean the apartment when she came home. I had a puppy and he was piling up behind a curtain somewhere, and I didn't see it. My mother came home early. She beat me and she beat my dog. I somehow got used to my own beatings, but beating my dog made me so horrified that I just raked up the puppy and went somewhere far away, didn't sleep at home. I was reproached all the time for being like my father's family, as if I could change that. My mother hated my grandmother. I could see the pain on her face when she noticed it. When I was 18, I decided it was time to split up, and then my mother changed her tactics. I still don't know what got into her. When I went abroad, she started calling me every day. She was affectionate, I thought. That's what my mother is like. Worried, probably just strict, but loves me very much. Abusive parents freak out when you become free. Because a joyful person is relaxed and it is something negative, they make you feel guilty. Eventually, you get used to not being happy yourself or not showing your joy. I even started hiding when I started doing something, some hobby, so I wouldn't be told anything, because it was like some kind of hypnosis. My mother controlled my leisure time. Come and weed my vegetable garden. Everybody's kids are like kids, and you freaks don't help. As soon as I made some progress, she would get anxious. Of course, there are kind of good moments. Some night where you can talk, even if you've been shat on a little bit. Kind of like, okay, we're related. It's like having a cake and putting a little potassium cyanide in it. For 6 months, I minimized communication. Then I went to therapy. When I was told not to communicate with my mother, I thought that a year was okay, but 5 years was a long time. The penultimate time we met, she hit me on the head. At that moment, my mother was doing my hair and wanted to spray it with nail polish. I'm allergic, so I told her my head would itch and I shouldn't do it. But she wasn't interested, and I insisted on doing it. And then I got hit on the head with all my might. I was not even angry. I realized that this marginalization is over the line and the strength to forgive no more. I just said, "That's it. I'm out of here." I don't know how she reacted to me cutting off communication because I blocked her completely right away. I didn't want to cut off her communication with my child at first, but I still decided it was for the best. My therapist diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like war veterans, though so many people who grew up with toxic parents have this diagnosis. And I didn't initially have much faith in her that my health and affairs would improve if I stopped communicating with my mother. After I stopped communicating, even my hormones started to come back to normal. A year went by, I was getting better and better. My nerves, my health were starting to come back to normal. Gradually, a picture began to emerge of what was happening to me. I could feel that some poison was gradually coming out of me, in some doses, as if this dysfunction was peeling away. My brain was rebuilding. Technically, you can communicate again, but it's toxic parenting. It's at the level of reflexes. The mother, her voice, her look, some intonation. They can have a depressing effect on a person. I already perceive her as a stranger. She's basically always been a stranger to me. It just has to be accepted as a disaster. There are people whose parents died in an accident. There's nothing you can do about it. If we happen to meet, I'll take her as any other woman in the street. No, I won't. I have nothing to talk about. I don't want to say anything anymore. I still have the feeling of someone who got out of prison after 20 years. I look at healthy people, how they live. I begin to painfully learn, one step at a time, how normal people live. After separation, it happens that the image of the mother is stratified, because there are both negative and positive moments. She cooked something, invited me to dinner, bought something beautiful. There is still a longing for glimpses, but I realize that this has nothing to do with the real person. I have a closed need for parental love because I understand that this connection will never happen again.